Let's talk about how not to become a gluten-free health disaster. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Well, first of all, when my Wheat Belly books first came out, some people said, well, I don't need to know all about that stuff because I already know what gluten-free is. Well, that's not what a Wheat Belly is. Wheat Belly was a rejection of this idea that grains, the seeds of grasses, are good for your health, because I don't believe they are. In fact, I think they're extremely destructive to your health. But it was not an embrace of gluten-free foods. Because when you go down the path of many gluten-free foods, you're led down the path of garbage ingredients, because the food industry either doesn't know or doesn't care to give you truly healthy ingredients. So gluten-free foods are typically made with one or more of the following ingredients: cornstarch, rice flour, tapioca starch, or potato flour. Well, you may already know that wheat products like whole grain bread, whole wheat bread, raises blood sugar higher than even table sugar. That's because of the amylopectin A, the unique digestibility of the amylopectin A by the enzyme amylase in your saliva and your stomach. Well, the starches in gluten-free flours are even more digestible, and when they're pulverized down to a fine flour, that increases the surface area for digestion exponentially. And so a food made of cornstarch or rice flour or those other gluten-free flours and starches raise blood sugar even higher than wheat, far higher than table sugar. In fact, there's no foods that raise blood sugar higher than gluten-free foods. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be naturally gluten-free. Let's say you have celiac disease, or dermatitis herpetiformis, or cerebellar ataxia, one of the many diseases that come from gluten exposure, not just celiac disease. Well, you have to be gluten-free. You'll do better by being grain-free also, but you can be gluten-free. An avocado is naturally gluten-free. An egg is naturally gluten-free. Pork chops, most other meats are naturally gluten. So you can be gluten-free, but you don't want to fall into the trap of resorting to those processed foods made with those four ingredients, gluten-free flour ingredients. So what happens when you include a lot of those gluten-free processed foods in your diet, like bagels or cakes or breads or pretzels? Well, first of all, your blood sugar goes sky high. And when blood sugar goes sky high, you induce a reaction called glycation, glucose modification of the body's proteins. And that's an irreversible reaction. So if you glycate the proteins in the lenses of your eyes, you get cataracts, opacities over time. If you glycate the cartilage cells in your knees and hips, you get brittle cartilage and then arthritis. If you glycate the skin, you get thin skin and brown aging spots. If you glycate brain tissue, you accelerate dementia. So glycation is a very important phenomenon. When you consume gluten-free foods, you massively accelerate glycation. Well, those high blood glucoses from gluten-free flours also provoke insulin, and repetitive high swings in insulin leads to insulin resistance, your body's inability to deal with insulin, and that's what causes weight gain and inflammation and increased risk for heart disease and cancer and other conditions. So increasing insulin resistance from gluten-free flours is very bad. The increase in insulin resistance leads to accumulation of visceral fat. You can't see visceral fat. It's deep within the organs and encircles the liver, pancreas, kidneys. It lines the intestines. But you can see its reflection on the surface. That is expressed on the surface as love handles or just a big belly. So that's why I call it wheat belly. But that visceral fat is also very inflammatory and does other peculiar things like disrupt hormones, like it raises testosterone in females. It reduces testosterone in males, and it's associated with man breasts and other hormonal disruptions. Gluten-free foods are extravagant triggers for small LDL particles. That's the real cause, one of the real causes for heart disease and heart attack, not LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol. That's a ridiculous notion, but it's one propped up by the billions of dollars obtained by Big Pharma, who persuaded, brainwashed, my colleagues that cholesterol was a cause for heart disease and that statin drugs was the only solution, which is a ridiculous idea. One of the much more powerful, reliable causes of coronary disease is an excess of small LDL particles. So you consume, let's say, a gluten-free bagel made with cornstarch and rice flour and tapioca starch, you trigger formation of small LDL particles for about a week. And these small LDL particles that persist for a long time are much more likely to be adherent to the artery wall, to gain entry into the wall, and to initiate oxidation and inflammation. So small LDL particles are perfectly crafted to cause heart disease. Unlike large LDL particles triggered by fat consumption, which persist only for about 24 hours, not days, are not very oxidation prone, are not very adherent to the artery wall, are not likely to provoke inflammation in the artery wall. So it's these small LDL particles and their peculiar behavior triggered by consumption of gluten-free foods. Gluten-free foods also trigger extravagant de novo lipogenesis. All that means is the starches from those gluten-free foods, when they get to the liver converts those starches into triglycerides, and they're released into the bloodstream as VLDL particles, very low density lipoproteins. Those VLDL particles are a major contributor to heart disease. They gain entry into the artery wall, they interact with with large LDL particles, making them small, and the triglycerides made by the liver, some stay put and stay in the liver, and that's how you get fatty liver. So gluten-free foods can not only be a major contributor to a rise in VLDL and thereby heart disease risk, they're also a major contributor to fatty liver, which is a big problem. Fatty liver is occurring at epidemic levels now, and it's leading to cirrhosis and liver failure in some people. So it's a big problem, and your gluten-free foods contribute to that process. Now, also be aware that gluten-free foods made with those 4 horrible starches are often not even gluten-free for 2 reasons. One, they're contaminated often by gluten residues. 10 to 30, sometimes 40% of the time, you'll find detectable and potentially dangerous levels of gluten and other residues of grain proteins in those gluten-free foods. So gluten-free foods are not what they claim to be. They are not gluten-free often, and they're therefore not safe. 2, there are proteins that act like the gliadin within gluten. So these are called prolamine proteins. Grains have something called prolamine. They're called that because they're rich in proline sequences that humans have a very difficult time digesting. But the gluten protein of wheat, the cecolin of rye, the hordein of barley, look a lot like the zein protein of corn. So corn products can reactivate celiac-type immune responses and other gluten-type responses because it overlaps in sequence with gluten or gliadin within gluten. So when you have a product made with cornstarch, it's the starch, not the protein, but the cornstarch is contaminated by the zein protein of corn. So a gluten-free food made with cornstarch can reactivate celiac disease, cerebellar ataxia, dermatitis herpetiformis, and other gluten reactions. So in my view, gluten-free processed foods like breads, bagels, etc. should not even be sold to the public. They're that awful for health. Now that doesn't mean you can't have a safe pizza or a cheesecake or pumpkin pie or gravy and biscuits. You can have all these kinds of wonderful tasting foods that are familiar, but we use different meals and flours to make them so that they're benign. You can have, say, a big slice of pizza or 3 and not have a rise in blood sugar, rise in insulin resistance, provocation of small LDL particles, a fatty liver, visceral fat growth. You can just have your pizza, enjoy it, and it tastes delicious. So that's what we do in my Wheat Belly Lifestyles. We recreate foods and don't resort to garbage gluten-free foods to replace the wheat and grain foods. Now, if you want the most updated source for my programs, including new recipes, new ideas, new success stories, and new concepts, I've put it all together, most recently in my revised and expanded edition of Wheat Belly, where I took all preceding books and combined the message, the programs, and the advice into one book. So banish processed gluten-free foods from your life. Nobody should be, maybe a rare indulgence perhaps, that's about as much as you should, but to make them a habitual source of food is asking for real trouble. And I would urge you not to do that.